Quick, name that tune. Ah, it's La Marseillaise, La Marseillaise. All right, friends, here we go. The French Revolution. So, to understand the French Revolution, we first have to understand what was going on in France in the late 1780s. Because as we all know, the French Revolution technically starts in the year... That's right, 1789. Can never forget that. So when we talk about France, we got to talk about what's known as the Old Regime, or the Ancien Regime. So we're talking about the political, social, and economic causes that ultimately lead to revolution themselves. So to understand what France looks like, let's first take a look at the political situation in France. As we know, we have the traditional absolute monarchy run by the Bourbon family. At this time in history, it is Louis XVI, and there he is, quite a strapping lad himself. The king still is absolute. He's choosing ministers and members of government by favoritism. We're talking about a king that suspends habeas corpus. The traditional concept of absolutism that we associate with kings is certainly no different here at all. Economically, France is in a dire situation as well. We still have that continuing debt that we saw before with Louis XIV. That's continuing over. France continues its deficit spending, literally meaning that it is spending money that doesn't have. Somewhere in excess of 50% of France's income is going to pay off its interest payments to other countries. Almost 8% is going to the king himself at Versailles. 25% is going to fund the army. So we have massive amounts of money that's not even really going back to the peasantry at all. It's being consumed by the nation that is having a terrible economic situation. And to understand the economic situation further, you have to understand the social situation, which so characterizes the revolution, and that's the estate system. And the estate system is a tie-over of medieval European feudalism, where we have the king on top, the peasants at the bottom, and obviously the varying degrees of nobility in between. So in terms of the estates, we've got three major estates. We've got the first estate, which is predominantly made up of clergy. That's right, clergy themselves, which are largely tax-exempt. They have a number of rights in the French government. The second estate itself is made up of nobility, also tax-exempt. It's privileged status. They have traditionally held the best jobs in government. They've been weakened throughout history, especially under Louis XIV and Richelieu and other French monarchs, but still the nobility has quite a bit of power. And then, of course, you have the third estate. What is the third estate? Well, it's everything. What has it been so far? Nothing. What does it hope to be? Something. Or so says Abbé Sieyès in his pamphlet, What is the Third Estate?, describing the plight of the peasantry. Now, to understand the Third Estate, we've got to realize that there are two parts to the Third Estate. We've got the bourgeoisie, which are the middle class. They are okay. They are professionals, doctors, lawyers. They have money. They are a little higher up in terms of the Third Estate in terms of how much money they make. And then, of course, you've got 9 out of 10 Third Estate members, and that, of course, are the peasants. The simple day laborer who toil in the fields, who pay the entire tax burden. As you've seen in this picture before right here, very common idea that we have the peasant who is drugged down and supported by the weight of the king and the nobles and the clergy. And we have this picture as well, a little similar, kind of the same idea, the oppressive rock that is crushing the peasantry at this point. So politically, socially, and economically, all things are adding up in the late 1780s to lead to revolution in France by 1789. So getting back to Louis XVI, we have to understand that he is judged in history as a fairly well-meaning king, but ultimately inefficient, who's not really able to get the job done. Still trying to hold on to that traditional ancestral idea of absolute power, divine right kind of inspired notions. The people support the king to some extent, but they're starting to understand that the king and the government are probably the cause of their problems. And any attempts to remedy the situation so far have been, of course, unsuccessful. Now, Louis's wife, the Austrian Marie Antoinette, is also not really looked upon very favorably by the French people themselves. They see her as being especially frivolous with money, the fact that she's Austrian herself. There had been reports before that she had been having numerous affairs. The alleged let them eat cake phrase, which she never actually said, but most peasants believe that she believed that she was so detached from the peasants that, simply cake would solve their needs. So, I mean, there's general animosity amongst the upper echelon of the society itself. So Louis, who's trying to remedy the situation as best as possible, has a number of different economic advisors who eventually tell him that the only thing that he really can do is tax the first two estates to improve the financial situation. Of course, upon trying that, it doesn't go very well. Obviously, the first two states are revolt against it, so Louis is kind of stuck. So there's popular support in calling the age-old French Parliament the Estates General, the general meeting of the estates, which so far up to this point in history, in 1789, had not met for well over 170 years. And that's pretty significant, because we associated this before with the fact that the French king was largely absolute because there was no one to check his power. So Louis, looking for some possible way to solve the dire financial crisis, in 1788, calls together the Estates General, which will meet in May of 1789, and this is a major step in French history, the idea of the French Parliament returning once again to advise the king on what situation can be taken. Now, of course, in the Estates General itself, it had been always known that the traditional voting structure of the assembly itself was a little bit unfair in the fact that each estate, or the representatives of each estate, met separately, and their vote was by order, and that means that each estate got one vote ultimately itself. So, of course, the first two estates, the tax-exempt privileged estates, would oftentimes vote against the third estate, always outvote them 2-1. And the third estate, having known this, largely refused to accept the idea that the Estates General was even going to do anything at all. So, before the convention even really kind of gets underway, members of the Third Estate, realizing the inequities that are inherent in the Estates General, decide to break away from the rest of the Estates General. And they form something called the National Assembly, and believe that they are the true representatives of France. 98% of the population is the Third Estate. And they think that this gives them the political authority to say what is ultimately right for the country. Now, believe it or not, many reform-minded members of the nobility, members of the clergy, leave beyond their estates and join up with the Third Estate, ultimately, in this National Assembly. Now, popular support amongst the National Assembly and amongst the people was growing to such a fever pitch that Louis was very reluctant to reject the National Assembly outright. He really couldn't do so. Political support was so against them that he reluctantly accepts it itself. So the National Assembly, which is now meeting as a true representative of France, one day is at Versailles, believing that they have been locked out of Versailles, swear that it's the king who's trying to ultimately destroy them and reinstitute the same old traditional structures, meet on a nearby indoor tennis court where they swear an oath, known as, of course, the Tennis Court Oath, where they swear that they will make a constitution for France. They swear to themselves, their lives, that they will not disband until a legitimate constitution has been made for the country, which can begin to fix the dire inequities that have existed so far within French history. So most of these reforms are amongst the upper echelons of the government itself. Now, the peasants at the lower level are largely thrilled over what's going on. They feel an incredible sense of attachment to the National Assembly and what they're trying to doing. It really feels like they're representing their interests. And the support behind the National Assembly prompts many peasants to feel like it is their duty themselves to protect its reforms, especially since it was assumed that Louis was ultimately going to do anything possible to subvert the National Assembly and to reinstitute his traditional authority. And this is largely what Louis was thinking about doing as well. So in 1789 of that year, Louis begins plans for dismantling the National Assembly. And understanding that this won't come without a bit of backlash, begins assembling troops to Paris to ultimately fend off any type of peasant rebellion that may exist. Now, the peasants, seeing this large influx of troops, were quick to figure out how they could stop Louis from doing this. The Marquis de Lafayette, the hero of two worlds, the great general who had fought alongside George Washington in the American Revolution, had a large support amongst the French peasants. He himself creates something known as the National Guard, which the duty is to protect the National Assembly against that of Louis himself. And there's quite a bit of support for him. People are going around, they're wearing ribbons and colors in the National Assembly. It's a very dangerous time to even admit that you're not supporting the National Assembly. There's a large amount of popular support there. So the peasants, who also feel that they themselves must take to arms, begin searching Paris everywhere they possibly can for any type of weapons in which to protect the National Assembly and the work they're doing. Upon gathering further weapons, they finally need gunpowder, and they decide that the Bastille, this medieval-looking fortress prison that was used to hold political prisoners in Paris, it was thought that it had a serious supply of gunpowder. So the peasants began to storm the Bastille on, do you remember the day? I'd be very impressed if you did. It is the French Independence Day. It's in July. Sounds like July 4th, but it's not July 4th. It's July 14th in 1789 that the peasants began to storm the Bastille. Unfortunately, the governor of the Bastille eventually surrenders it to the citizens. The citizens rush in. They wind up killing the guards, slaughtering the Marquis de Launay, who was the governor himself, and they seize the Bastille, and that is really seen as the beginning of the French Revolution itself, the time when the peasants actually take power into their own hands and strike against a symbol of the king. You know, this prison, which had symbolized Louis in many respects, ultimately is struck out against. And you know, and the funny thing is that honestly, the Bastille wasn't even that big of a prison. There were only 6 inmates there when it was stormed. It's kind of ironic, but ultimately, the Bastille is seen as a symbol of the oppression of the king himself, and this, of course, is largely going to be dealt with himself. Now, the rebellions that institute the Bastille are seen amongst the government as a revolution. We start to see these similar ideas spread out into the countryside with something known as the Great Fear, where there are rumors of bands of marauders, you know, attacking the countryside. So peasants begin to go to their nobles' landlords' homes and start ransacking them, burning old tax records, kicking the nobles out, fearing what might happen if they are returned to the old slavery and if the situation continues. So now the National Assembly, which is struggling to put together a constitution, first agrees that the estates will have to give up their privileges. Now, it seems like a major step for France to take, but honestly, the first and second estates had not lost anything they hadn't lost already. They were going to lose their privileges one way or the next. They voted themselves out of privileges by themselves in the National Assembly. And to begin work on a major document known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Not a constitution, but a document that stresses that all men in France are created equal, and it's based off of the ideals of the Enlightenment and also ideals of the American Declaration of Independence, which the French will often look towards as a successful example of rebelling against an oppressive system and then instituting Enlightenment concepts. So these ideas are key, that they bring in both this American aspect and this Enlightenment aspect, and basically say that men are born free and remain equal in rights, that they can't be subject to cruel and unusual punishment, all the basic things you would assume that a citizen has. And this is considered as a major step towards creating an eventual constitution. But unfortunately, the peasants who are still out in revolutionary fervor in the streets are still suffering from the economic crisis, the price of grain, the price of grain and the terrible harvest of 1788 has led to skyrocketing bread prices, such to the fact that women are beginning to amass and plan to protest the king themselves. So in October of 1789, a number of women get together, almost over 1,000, and begin to march towards Versailles, demanding to see the king, demanding to see Marie Antoinette, and demanding some relief for this bread crisis. This mob begins to move. Lafayette tries to stop them, but he is almost powerless to stop them themselves. And they go to Versailles, where they demand to see the king. And they inevitably kill the guards, rush into Versailles, and demand that the king return to Paris with them. They believe that the king, who should be in the capital, they want to see their king. They demand that him and his wife and his kids return with them to Paris. And so Louis does. The whole family returns pretty much under arrest to Paris, where they'll spend the rest of their lives in the Tuileries Palace in Paris. Believing that the king was able to provide some type of relief for this crisis. And we talked about this before. They're bringing back the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy. That Louis is someone who actually stopped this financial crisis and fix things and bring some type of release to the country themselves. So all the while this is going on, the National Assembly is still working to pump out this constitution. The king is still under house arrest in Paris. Later that year, the National Assembly issues something called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, which effectively puts the Catholic Church under the authority of the French government, which is especially important because the National Assembly was believing that oftentimes throughout French history, we oftentimes see the clergy fooling around with government affairs. So by doing this, by severing the ties to Rome, they're certainly hoping that they'll be able to keep a watch over the clergy themselves. This creates a tremendous rift, not just within the church itself, but within society. Peasants aren't really sure if they support this idea. Either way, it's considered in many respects to be the first blunder of the National Assembly. But by 1791, they finally pump out that constitution, known as the Constitution of 1791, because, as you know, there will be more than one. And we see the establishment of what type of government? Do you remember? If you said limited monarchy, you are correct. It was a limited monarchy. Still Louis, still around. They weren't ready to get rid of the king just yet. Still keeping the king around, and they're looking to have a legislative assembly now. They renamed the National Assembly the Legislative Assembly, which will be able to make laws. The king would only be able to veto them themselves. But a lot of people are still very unhappy with this constitution. It does not provide universal suffrage. It still stops many people from voting themselves. Only like 15,000 people in French society could actually run for the Legislative Assembly. The king could veto laws, effectively still giving him absolute power. There's still a lot of support against the Constitution of 1791. And we talk about specifically where members sat in the Legislative Assembly in this new government. And it kind of has determined the modern political spectrum of things. If you sat on the right, you were considered to be more of a conservative. You thought that the revolution was over. The Constitution of 1791 completed what they set out to do. They wanted to make a new government. They wanted to fix the problems. They wanted to reform things, make a constitution, and they did so. It seemed to them that the revolution was complete. You have those in the middle which weren't really sure, kind of moderates, not really 100% sure what was, one way or the other. And then on the left side, you have more radical members who want to see the revolution's reforms go further, believing that this was just the beginning step. And these people were known as the Jacobins. And the Jacobins were arguing for an increased republic where all citizens have the right to vote, where there would not be a king at all. So everything we've talked about now, from the storming of the Bastille all the way up to the Constitution of 1791, this is known as the Moderate Revolution. The reforms have not been that radical. They've been fairly moderate. They want a constitution. They get a constitution. It's cute. They love it. Everything seems to be okay. But of course, there is things going on behind the scenes, and specifically, the many nobles and clergy are leaving the country in mass numbers. This immigré, these immigrants who are leaving and telling horror stories in other countries of what's going on in France. Peasants have stolen my land, everybody's out of control, and are scaring the pants off of other countries. Traditional monarchs around Europe fear what's known as the French plague. They are worried that this tide of revolution will extend beyond the borders of France and come to their own country and threaten their legitimate existence. So there is quite a bit of fear that the revolution will spread. So in seeing this, it kind of gives us an idea of the external feelings towards the French Revolution. Now the question is, why does the revolution itself push radical? Well, it comes down to a few things. Number one, Louis himself, very unhappy with the Constitution of 1791, humiliated at the loss of his power, is convinced by a number of his ministers, as well as Marie Antoinette, to escape in the middle of the night. So Louis and his family disguise themselves as a Russian aristocratic family and begin to make way for the French border. Unfortunately, that night they are found, they are discovered, they are brought back to Paris and labeled as traitors to the revolution. Those who were conspiring with the enemy to leave the country. That was seen as an internal threat, a threat to the revolution that came from the king himself. The external threat comes from the fact that the countries of Austria and Prussia, in something known as the Declaration of... You remember what it was called? The Declaration of... It's Pillnitz. Declaration of Pillnitz, Austria and Prussia threatened to intervene in France if the French citizens don't restore the Bourbon family back to their absolute nature. Now, we know that the Declaration of Pillnitz was largely just an idle threat, but the revolutionaries took this very seriously, believing that the conspiratorial kings of other countries were going to come in and return them to the old slavery. So now we've got the king as an internal threat, and now Austria and Prussia as external threats coming in apparently to threaten the revolution. And suddenly now popular support swells behind the Jacobins. And the Jacobins, who begin to take more power within the government, now call for a second constitution, one that excludes the king altogether and makes way for more of a French republic itself. So the Jacobins make this new constitution, providing for yet another government of France, and this now known as the National Convention. So we've gone from the States General to the National Assembly to the Legislative Assembly, now to the National Convention. The National Convention, which is a republic and allows for universal male suffrage. Women are still left out. Even the Declaration of the Rights of Man, they are left out of that as well. And the National Convention, which is fearing for the safety of the revolution, established something called the Committee of Public Safety, an attempt to purge out and protect the revolution from all threats themselves. And of course, this Committee of Public Safety is under the leadership of the very cold, very callous, very calculating Maximilien Robespierre, the leading Jacobin himself. So it's the National Convention that decides that the king, who is apparently conspiring with the Austrians and Prussians, must be put on trial for treason. Of course, he's found guilty, and he is ultimately executed himself. The guillotine catches up with Louis, and he is killed in 1793. In January of that year. So, with the death of the king and with the death of Marie Antoinette later that year in October, we now see, what we're going to move into now, the radical phase of the revolution. We start to see this bloodletting where we're pushing the revolution farther and to greater extremes, and we want to get rid of the king and make more changes that give liberty, fraternity, and equality to the people themselves. And the National Convention declares war on Austria, declares war upon Prussia, declares war upon Great Britain as these great monarchical states that represent a threat to the reforms of the revolution, and begin to fight them as well. So now a country which is in the midst of a revolution is now fighting multiple countries as well. And we're going to start to see the French start a draft, and young men are brought to this draft and such. And it's Robespierre who is trying to protect the revolution at all costs. He is seemingly trying to purge out any counter-revolutionary elements and begin something known as the Reign of Terror. In the span of a year between July 1793 and July of 1794, Robespierre is the architect of a mass arrest of anyone who is even slightly considered to be counter-revolutionary, from something as simple as possessing a letter that had the seal of the king on it, all the way up to giving revolutionary soldiers sour wine, could well have called for your death and your ultimate beheading by the guillotine. And it's 40,000 people in the span of that year that are purged out and are killed because of Robespierre and Robespierre's quest for this republic of virtue, believing that virtue without terror was fatal, and that terror without virtue was powerless. So, he's very calculating, wanting a republic of virtue, kind of based around Rousseau's ideas, where they would attempt to create ultimately a stronger a stronger situation in the country that would see the death of enemies of the revolution itself. So Robespierre, who institutes his reign of terror, eventually gets killed by the terror himself. The public, in the span of a year, and tired of the repeated executions and the bloodletting, tires of Robespierre, and there's this massive reform against him himself, a massive movement against Robespierre is ultimately convicted of inciting counter-revolutionary violence and is sentenced to the guillotine as well. And in an ironic twist of fate, the beheader is ultimately beheaded. And the pendulum swings back again as we have moderates who come back into power now and instill the third constitution for France in as little as 4 years, and that is a new constitution that sets up a 5-man ruling board known as the Directory, which is ultimately weak and corrupt, but is a little bit more moderate compared to that of the Republicans and the Jacobins. And we see now the Directory, which is hoping to turn to a young man who can hopefully help them advance their goals, a fantastic upstart young general in the Wars of the Revolution, the charismatic and the calculating, strategic, all-around military genius that is the young Napoleon Bonaparte. So Napoleon Bonaparte, as we know, comes from the island of Corsica, off the coast of France, showcases extraordinary military abilities at a young age, attends the Brion Military Academy, rises to the ranks very quickly, becoming an officer at the age of 16, and who fights brilliantly in these Wars of the Revolution, eventually kicking the British out of the port city of Toulon, defeating the Austrians in Italy. Napoleon just seems to be everything to all people. He has his myth of invincibility about him, and his ambition is driving him. He takes many of the dangers himself. He just seems larger than life for a lot of people, until he goes to Egypt to counter perhaps the greatest enemy to France in the Revolution, and that's Great Britain. Unfortunately, his Egyptian campaign is a disaster, ultimately, for him. While we do have great archaeological finds, like the Rosetta Stone and such, Napoleon eventually reluctantly returns to France, where the situation is growing increasingly hostile towards his Directory. Napoleon, seizing opportunity and with great support behind him, stages what's known as a coup d'etat in November of 1799 and effectively sets up something called the Consulate, where he himself is first consul, a post which pretty much has dictator-like powers. So Napoleon, who now seeks to reform the French government as best he can, a guy that supports the ideas of the revolution largely, but rather than liberty, equality, fraternity, is actually promoting order, stability, and efficiency. He is taking away women's rights, but he's also promoting certain rights of the revolution. His Napoleonic Code, the system of laws in which he creates, is incredibly important in the fact that it creates equality, the ideals of religious toleration, the basis of a meritocracy, meaning that your positions come based upon how good you are at something. He makes peace with the Catholic Church. He encourages the emigre to return. He recognizes the peasants' seizure of church lands. He just pleases everyone amongst society, with the exception of the royalists, who, of course, believe that he's supporting the revolution too much, and, of course, the true revolutionaries who see him as another monarch. But ultimately, we understand that there's a wide support for Napoleon amongst all bases of civilization at this time, because they're tired of the upheavals of the French Revolution, the bloodiness that has so characterized the Revolution and the French Plague. I mean, we even have ideas such as this picture right here, where other nations literally believe that the French were crazy. They were crazy drunkards just lobbing off people's heads left and right, which is an idea of foreign opinion. So Napoleon really tries to react against this. So supporting the ideas of the revolution, but almost betraying them at the same time in many respects. Napoleon, no matter where he turns, holds what's called plebiscites, which granted limited suffrage to people, where they can literally vote yes or no on a certain issue and say, yes, Napoleon, we support you, or no, Napoleon, we do not support you on things. And almost at every turn, people give incredible support to Napoleon himself, and they just firmly believe what he is doing. In 1804, Napoleon, hoping for increased power, decides to declare himself Emperor of the French. Invites the Pope to come to Notre Dame to coronate him as Emperor. Upon the coronation, Napoleon seizes the crown from the Pope and places it on his own head, a very politically symbolic gesture that he himself owes his post to no one. He and Josephine eventually become Emperor and Empress of France, and are still continuing to fight the wars of the Revolution, which are now known as the Napoleonic Wars, as country after country unite against Napoleon. He is just worth, they said, 40,000 men on the battlefield. He himself has this myth of invincibility that portrays about him, and by all respects, he is. As his armies move through Europe, he is bringing the ideals of the French Revolution. these French soldiers, which are guided by the ideals of nationalism, their patriotic fervor for what they've done for the revolution, they're bringing nationalism to other countries. But the interesting thing here is that as Napoleon takes over other countries, the citizens of those countries see Napoleon as an occupying force, and nationalism within their own countries begins. So the French are motivated by nationalism, and now because you have a foreign invader in your countries, common enemies, spark the ideals of nationalism. So now we start to see the Prussians feeling more nationalistic, the Italians feeling more nationalistic. So Napoleon, by exporting the revolution, as he was known as the revolution on horseback. Wherever he goes, he brings the revolution. We also encourage nationalism throughout Europe, which is going to be a major force throughout much of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, all up until World War I. So Napoleon, who just seems to be on top of everything, he is redrawing the maps of Europe, he is placing monarchs on the throne, almost all of continental Europe is allied with him in some way or shape or form, except for the one country that continues to elude him, and of course that country is Great Britain. Britain just seems to defy Napoleon at every turn. He eventually tries to invade Britain, but is ultimately defeated at a naval battle off the coast of Spain, known as the Battle of Trafalgar, which he's not able to defeat the British at any respect. He also loses the Peninsular War in Spain itself. So Napoleon seems to be losing his edge in many respects, but ultimately decides to confront Britain not by military, but by economic means, and by instituting something known as the Continental System, by which he hopes to strike at Britain's economic situation by barring all of Napoleon's allies from trading with Britain. He hopes to kind of starve them out and to have them bow before him. Unfortunately, though, it's the Continental System that eventually gets America involved in the War of 1812. It's the Continental System that not just hurts Britain, but also hurts the economy of all of Europe. So smuggling, blockade running becomes the norm. Everyone's trying to get around Napoleon's edict. And it's Napoleon that seems to have made a tremendous mistake with the Continental System and loses a lot of popular support. Russia, under the head of Tsar Alexander I, also pulls out of the Continental System. Napoleon, not backing down to the Tsar himself, decides to launch a massive invasionary force. Napoleon assembles his grand army, 600,000 men invade the mighty behemoth that is Russia. And it's this Russian campaign that will ultimately be Napoleon's undoing. On their journey to Moscow, Napoleon's men are trying to fight the Russians, but the Russians don't attack Napoleon. They allow him to enter their country, and they follow what's known as a scorched earth policy. And basically what that means is that they destroy their own crops, they destroy their own towns, they destroy their own support, and by doing so, they're denying Napoleon the ability to use their resources. So Napoleon's supply lines are getting farther and farther. He's moving into the Russian expanse. He's being attacked by marauding Russian warriors who are coming out against him, and eventually, of course, the famous Russian winter sets in, and Napoleon's troops begin to freeze. They finally reach Moscow. The Russians burn Moscow to the ground, so Napoleon can't use it. So honestly, his invasion of Russia was really for naught. Upon retreat, the winter just closes in, and out of the 600,000 men that Napoleon entered Russia with, only 100,000 will come out alive. 500,000 men of Napoleon's grand army will die in Russia. And it's a similar mistake we're going to see Adolf Hitler make in World War II as well, is this trying to invade Russia in winter. Just does not work out. So Napoleon limps home, now having been defeated, his army lost, is finally forced to abdicate the throne, which basically means to step down. It's the European powers which exile him to the tiny island of Elba on in the Mediterranean off the coast of Italy. In the meantime, the Bourbon monarchy has been restored by the foreign powers. The King Louis XVIII is now back on the throne, and things aren't going well in France. People had gotten used to the reforms of the revolution, had gotten used to Napoleon's upholding of certain revolutionary ideas, that there's a popular support against Louis XVIII. So it's plucky Napoleon that eventually commandeers a few ships, returns to France, escapes the Isle of Elba, marches to Paris, and wherever Louis XVIII sends out men to stop Napoleon, Napoleon is just so charismatic. He stands before the men and says, if you want to shoot me, you can shoot me. But of course, none of them do. They join Napoleon's ranks. Anybody that Louis XVIII sends out to destroy Napoleon, they just join up with Napoleon instead, and Napoleon just marches triumphantly to Paris, where he is just seemingly have returned from the dead. He becomes emperor again, and he rules for what's called the 100 Days. Napoleon is in power for right about 100 days as well. He tries to offer gestures of peace towards his neighbors, but they won't buy it. And another force is amassing to remove Napoleon once again. Napoleon thinks he can outwit the British and the Prussians, and tries to destroy their armies before they have a chance to amass. And they are amassing in a small Belgian town known as Waterloo. And so it is Napoleon that quickly assembles an army to destroy the British and the Prussians. But because of a rainstorm and a few other notable facts, the battle gets pushed back. Britain is now under the head of the Duke of Wellington, a guy by the name of Arthur Wellesley, who has been studying Napoleonic warfare and is Napoleon's equal in many respects. And Napoleon just can't seem to get the edge on Wellington. The Prussians are amassing again, and eventually Napoleon is defeated for the last time at the Battle of Waterloo, where he is exiled yet again to the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic, where Napoleon will live out his final days and die 6 years later. So, from 1799 to 1815 is the Napoleonic era, a triumphant rise of this great general who was ultimately destroyed by his own ambition, his own ego, and his own undoing itself. So, following the downfall of Napoleon, we see the European powers amass in Austria at something known as the Congress of Vienna, where they figure out, how to put Europe back together again in the wake of Napoleon. And of course, these conservative reactionaries win out, and the traditional monarchs begin to literally turn the clocks back and to implement monarchies again. They reaffirm that France should be ruled by a king. They uphold the balance of power, this traditional idea that no one country in Europe can get too powerful. And we saw what happened when that occurred. Napoleon got so powerful that it challenged most of Europe in an incredibly threatening manner. So the Congress of Vienna, pretty much run by a few notable figures, Charles Maurice Talleyrand, a guy that you will hear later again in US 1, who eventually works for France, the famous Clemens von Metternich, who believes in establishing conservative values, putting back kings and turning the clocks back. So the Congress of Vienna effectively undoes the French Revolution, and monarchs are back on the throne, and it'll stay this way for a few years until we see revolutions again in the 19th century. But the revolution really kind of has come full circle with the old regime kind of back in place in certain regards. So it's nationalism that really spreads throughout Europe because of Napoleon, because of the revolution. Other effects of the revolution, we see the end of the state system for a time, the end of the absolute monarchy for a time, the end of the financial crisis, the idea that taxation should be based upon equality, the idea is that all citizens have basic rights that they had to enjoy, public education, which has returned. So there are a number of things that really are notable about the French Revolution. It's seen as a success and a failure in a lot of different ways, but it's the Congress of Vienna that does push back the time until we can talk further of when the French really kind of rebel yet again. But this is the story of the French Revolution, the story of an absolute monarchy that has lasted much longer than it ever intended to. We unlike in England, where we have a slow evolution of constitutional ideas, the French Revolution is a revolution that happens quickly and over a period of 10 years, not counting the reign of Napoleon, which goes from extremes, from a monarch to a moderate period to a radical period, back to a moderate period again to a dictator. It's this constant back and forth notion that so characterizes the French Revolution. But the key is the French Revolution will be the model for revolutions in later years. It is the quintessential revolution in Europe, and we will continue to talk about the effects of the French Revolution, which will be felt much later on as well. I would continue to understand chronology. I would understand when things happen. You don't want to think that the continental system came before the calling of the Estates General or anything like that. You would have a basic idea of chronology, basic understanding of who the people are, and the notable figures that have really defined this unit. Well, hope it was helpful. Hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. So let's bring back a little La Marseillaise to finish this out.